right. We good to go? Okay. Evening, everybody. Choctaw Church, good to see you again. I'm hearing good things about how VBS went, so that's excellent. I hope it really was a success. And we're back into it. This is week 4, I think, for our prophets study, 8th century prophets. All the kids out of the room? Okay. It is a true statement that not all of the Bible is meant for kiddos. And you become reminded of that if you weren't fully aware of that beforehand when you have, especially the really little ones, like my wife and I do right now. All right? I have 2 young sons at home, and I can't imagine the story of Hosea featuring in the children's Bible. If it's out there in any children's Bibles, it shouldn't be. Kids aren't ready for that yet. But the thing is, we all grow up from that innocence of childhood, and we become not so innocent. We are all there. If you are a confessing Christian, I think I'm talking to that kind of audience, then I think you should be aware. I think that's even part of your confession. We know we're sinners. We know that we are saved only by the grace of God through his Son, Jesus Christ. And that is in the face of the world in all of its grittiness. And that's what we encounter in the prophet Hosea. Last week, not last week, 2 weeks ago, last time I spoke with y'all, we ended Amos. Now we're moving on to Hosea. And I left you with something to mull over, which is to say, in Amos's charge to the Israelites of his time, mid-8th century BC, accusing them not so much of wrong ritual practices, wrong worship practices, but wrong societal practices, wrong politics, wrong or even lack of concern for the poor out there, apathy. What I wanted to charge you all to continue to think about is, does that speak to me? Should it? Do I need to be woken up from somewhat of a stupor of my own? Especially being mindful that I think particularly within churches of Christ, having grown up myself in churches of Christ, that restoration movement, we've often prided ourselves in getting back to the correct worship, right? Singing, practice of baptism, communion, and these are all important things to be sure, just like the sacrificial system was in Amos's day. And yet, imagine again just how striking a statement that would have been coming from the mouth of this prophet, delivering Yahweh's words to say, what does all this mean to me, these sacrifices that you bring, even though they're commanded in law? And so, again tonight, I hope I can keep that mental state fresh in you and encourage you all, be ready and be willing always to be shocked by these prophets and yet not give up listening to their message, especially believing as we do that as the Word of God, these texts, as ancient as they are, still have a very profound message for us today. So we jump into the story and the opening oracles of Hosea the prophet. I'm titling tonight's lesson, Take for Yourself a Woman of Fornication, and our subtitle is A Love That Defies Logic. Hosea 1 through 3 is what we're looking at. Here are the opening lines. Hosea 1 through 2 says, The word of Yahweh that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, the beginning of Yahweh's word by Hosea. I'll stop there for a moment. That text that we've just read is what you call the superscription. That just tells you background so that you can place this prophet within his appropriate time and situation. Thankfully, a number of the prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible provide us with that kind of background information. Amos was another such book. So this tells us that Hosea is another 8th century prophet. That's not a surprise in this ongoing series. And he began most likely a little after Amos's time. So Amos, there's a pretty good consensus in biblical scholarship that he may have been the earliest of the writing prophets of Israel or Judah. And so Hosea is roughly a contemporary with Amos, also, it seems, addressing primarily the people of the north, Israel, that nation. And so let's see how this really narrative starts to unfold as his book opens. Yahweh said to Hosea, "Go take for yourself a woman of fornication and children of fornication, for the land has indeed committed fornication and turned away from Yahweh." And this is the classic picture we all have of Hosea. That prophet, more than that, a human being like ourselves, who feels the pain of unrequited love. Right? And too many of us know what that is, whether it be from times of dating period to maybe some even here tonight who have faced that in a marriage relationship. And it is tragic whenever it happens, when love is broken like that. And so this is what Hosea himself, we're told, will be made to go through. He takes for himself a woman of fornication. Alternatively, your translations might say a woman of prostitution. That's the origin of this term has very much to do with the world of prostitution. That is for sure. But this will serve as an object lesson, right? The relationship between Hosea and his soon-to-be wife, we find out her name is Gomer, is going to stand as a symbol for God's relationship with Israel. So let's continue verses 3 through 5. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then Yahweh said to him, "Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will account the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. And I shall bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It shall be on that day that I shall break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." A few things to note here. First of all, not only is Hosea and his wife, not only do they stand as a symbol, but even his children have symbolic names given to them. Nothing to do with their actions. For all we know, these kids are completely innocent of any implications, but that's just kind of the way that it falls out in this narrative, that their names signify an important message for Israel. And it's somewhat confusing because the preceding text told us, take for yourself not only a wife of fornication, but children of fornication, as if to imply that the children were born out of wedlock, or at least not between Hosea and Gomer themselves. And whatever you make of how these children came to be born between these two texts, the important thing is not really that, but it's what are these children named? And there's another object lesson in that. This first child is named Jezreel, and some of you may know there is a valley called Jezreel in the northern part of Israel. I'll skip to that here briefly. There we go. And it is a strategic military point in Israel's history, in part because it breaks apart an otherwise continuous mountainous and hilly chain that runs from those southern foothills of Judah all the way up into the regions of Galilee and beyond, even up into the Lebanon. And so the Valley of Jezreel is called a valley because it breaks that mountain chain. Any number of ancient battles were fought around this very valley because you could bring chariots and armies right through there rather conveniently as opposed to over the hills. Now, you notice that there is a pronouncement here in Hosea's opening words about the house of Jehu. It said that this child will be named Jezreel in particular because in a while, here's the voice of Yahweh, "I will account the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu." Now, what is in mind here when Hosea delivers this oracle of God? First of all, the house of Jehu is currently on the throne when Hosea begins his ministry because that opening text told us, verse 1, that Hosea began his ministry in the days of Jeroboam, king of Israel. That's Jeroboam the second. So he is descended from Jehu. And it's in the middle of that dynasty that Hosea delivers his oracles. Now, Jehu, maybe I'll open it up to you all. Tell me what you know about Jehu from your own Bible studies, Bible classes. Furious driver, yeah, apparently reckless driver in his chariot, yeah. Other things that you might remember about Jehu? He had a very interesting charge, you might say, given to him when he stepped up to the kingship.
He was one that's related to what God was wanting to do in regard to correcting some of these people.
That's right. Yes. It was just said, Jehu has the same sympathies with God about what needs to be changed in Israel. And so at the beginning of his reign, as we're told in the narrative of 2 Kings, he seems to have the same agenda with Yahweh, the God of Israel. Let's get back to Yahweh's concerns, and away from all the corruption that had taken place under the regime of the dynasty of Omri. Perhaps more infamous for Omri's son, Ahab, right? Infamous Ahab, whether it be in the Bible or Moby Dick, bad guy. But here's the thing. Jehu, when he is anointed, and I encourage you on your own time, read 2 Kings 9 and 10, Elisha the prophet sends one of his, you might say, prophets in training, one of his subordinates, to go and anoint Jehu and tell him his mission from God, which is not only, hey, you're anointed like David was, but rather, unlike David, remember when David was anointed, did he stretch out his hand against the previous anointed? Not at all. In fact, he made a very strong point of saying, I have not stretched out my hand against the Lord's anointed. I would never dream of doing such. Because he revered the fact that Saul himself had been anointed by God, and so he would not strike down Saul because even though Saul was seeking David's life, he had a holy charge over him. He had been anointed. Well, Jehu is told, we're told in 2 Kings 9, that he is to cut off the last remnants of the household of Ahab. So Ahab by this point is already dead, but Jehu is going to just wipe out every single last potential candidate for the throne from that dynasty. That's striking, especially when you contrast it with the activities of David, that most famous of the anointeds of God until Christ himself, Jesus, came. But here's the thing. It's an interesting conversation between that one text in 2 Kings 9 into chapter 10, where Jehu calls for the slaughter of 70 sons, 70 descendants of the line of Ahab. Guess where? In the valley of Jezreel. And to contrast that with how David waited in good time for Yahweh to deliver the throne to him. Now again, 2 Kings tells us that this is the word of Yahweh through that prophet. But interestingly, there's a strange text here in Hosea when you read that together with that text of 2 Kings. And I think in many respects it should leave us scratching our heads. Are we talking about other incidents at Jezreel? Perhaps. But this was such a significant event, this massive slaughter under the guidance of Jehu to kill off the previous dynasty in the valley of Jezreel, that it seems like it's almost too coincidental. What is going on here? Could it be just the complicated nature of what it is to follow God in this world as messed up as it is? Obviously, Ahab's household had done great wrong when they were on the throne. Ahab had a lot of blood on his hands, to be sure. And Jehu, we believe, is anointed by God, to be sure. At the same time, is it somewhat like that conversation that God had with David when David wanted to build a temple for God, and God said, not in your days, because you have what? Blood on your hands. Yeah, you've spilled much blood. And in part, that may be that God wanted to really establish the temple during a time of peace, when things had really settled down, and that happened in Solomon's reign, at the beginning of it. But on another note, perhaps there's something to the fact that even though David fought Yahweh's battles on behalf of Israel against the Philistines, that when all is said and done, that's a lot of bloodshed, and is that what God is about? So take that for what you will. I don't want to give you an easy answer because I don't think there is necessarily an easy answer when we read this passage of Hosea, but it is certainly calling down accusations on the house of Jehu. Yes, Dayton.
Used Nebuchadnezzar as a servant of his in order to punish his people, and yet later Nebuchadnezzar was severely punished because of some of his motive and procedures.
Yes, another great point. Just like God uses Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument. And in fact, I think when we finish up our 8th century prophets, I'll probably try to include some passages about how even the Assyrian armies before Nebuchadnezzar's time were also Yahweh's instrument, his weapon against his own people. But that's a complicated thing. Yes, they were doing the work of God, but they weren't necessarily thinking of themselves as being God's agents in that capacity. Yeah, Marty.
Was it true that Jezreel and Megiddo were more or less synonymous? And that they became to be known, for example, we have talked about Waterloo.
Yes.
Armageddon.
Yeah, so the question there is, are Megiddo and Jezreel, Valley of Jezreel, synonymous? Like Waterloo for us, or some of those famous battle sites, Gettysburg and so forth. And I would say, yes, Megiddo is particularly a town on the western side of the Jezreel Valley, and that's why so many battles historically were fought there, because it just tragically, perhaps, found itself on that major thoroughfare. Yeah, good question. All right, so this is the first of Hosea's children, named Jezreel, a very dark, ominous tone over the birth of a child, which, you'd hope would be a very happy occasion. But unfortunately, this is how things unfold in the life of Hosea and his family. And here's a picture of Jehu, by the way. It's interesting that even though we don't often have characters of the Bible mentioned in works outside the Bible from other nations, occasionally you will see mention of them. And here is a stele of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, in which we actually see Jehu depicted as bowing in a servant role before him. That tells you that even within the 9th century, predating the time of Hosea, that the Assyrians, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was already in power and flexing its muscles, so to speak, throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. That's going to continue to be an important fact for us, because Yahweh is going to be using these Assyrians, as we find in these prophets, to judge his own people. Right? But politically speaking, that domination had already existed before the 8th century. And let me remind you of these dynasties of Israel, especially when you compare these red lines, which all stand for the end of one dynasty, the beginning of another, and you contrast that with the column to the right, Judah's kingdom. After all, how many dynasties was Judah supposed to have? After Saul, of course. Just the one, right? 2 Samuel chapter 7, God makes that lasting covenant with David that he will always have someone to sit on the throne. And you see that fulfilled as one generation passes, another one comes on, but still David's family retains the throne. And yet in Israel, you see a stark contrast. That's because even the very first king of that separated nation, the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam I, decided to depart from the ways of Yahweh, and accordingly, he lost any chances of having an equally eternal dynasty. And so by this point in history, we're talking about Jeroboam II. One generation before that, dynasty of Jehu is about to be cut off. I think you can see it there on the left side. And we're about to see, especially if you can judge from all of those red lines, a very serious time of turmoil in the northern kingdom of Israel. Can you imagine how each of those dynasties might perhaps end if you don't remember exactly? Think politically. How do dynasties often end? Regicide, right? Somebody gets killed. And so we see that in these last years where Israel is a sovereign, distinct nation before they are taken into captivity away from their land by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Let's continue. The second of Hosea's children. Then she conceived again and bore a daughter, and he said to him, "Call her name Lo Ruhamah, for I shall not continue to love the house of Israel, but I shall indeed hate them." Strong words, right? "But the house of Judah I shall love, and I shall save them by Yahweh their God. I shall not save them by bow, by sword, by battle, by horses, or by horsemen." Now you have a twofold statement here. The one is very favorable toward Judah, even though the Lord will have some things to say against Judah in the coming weeks we'll study. But alternatively, focus on what God here says to Israel. Again, a very, very disturbing few lines. First of all, that God would say, I do not love Israel, or I will not continue to love Israel. And that's what the name Lo Ruchama means, unloved. What a terrible thing to name your daughter, right? Terrible. I can't even stomach that. I can't even imagine being in that position as a parent. But this is the burden of the prophet. And so this child also stands as a symbol of Israel's relationship with her God. And so hopefully this beloved child gets named so unfortunately because God is saying, Israel is not right with me at the time being. Now, he says such with very broad, sweeping statements. Does God ultimately really hate Israel? No. What does even the New Testament teach us? God wants all to be saved. Or John 3:16, God so loved the world. God's love is immense, unfathomable, and we know from multiple scriptures that God loves even the northern nation of Israel in the midst of all their sins. But it's a wake-up call when God uses such stark language to arrest the attention of his audience and say, something needs to change. You may feel comfortable, but things are not as right as you imagine them to be. And then we continue with the birth of the third of these children in the next verses. When she had weaned Lo Ruchama, she conceived and bore a son, and he said, call his name Lo Ami, which means in Hebrew, not my people, because you are not my people, and I am not your God. And if the preceding statements had not been shocking enough and disturbing enough in terms of that position, that secure position that Israel felt she had with her God, now we even have a reversal of covenant language. Because classically, if you look back at Torah in books like Exodus, and it's repeated again, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God says to Israel, you shall be my people, I shall be your God. Those are covenant words. They would have been on everybody's tongue. They would have been recitable by every Israelite. And here's a prophet of Israel delivering the message of the God of Israel, which reverses what they had come to feel as a pillar of reality itself. Here's God now telling them, you are not my people, and I am not your God. Say that as many times as you might like, and think of yourselves as my people, but you're not acting that way. That's not the case. Again, a harsh reality in the life of this prophet, speaking to an even harsher reality in the lives of Israel at large. Well, let's move on then to what flowers out of Hosea's continuing oracles. Here again, this continues Yahweh's message through the prophet. Say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruchama, contend with your mother, contend, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. That she remove her fornication from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Lest I strip her naked and make her as the day she was born. Like I said, this is not kids' material. And I set her up like the desert and place her like a parched land and put her to death with thirst. Her children I shall not love. Again, terrible, striking statements. For they are children of fornication. Indeed, their mother has fornicated. She has conceived them dishonorably. She has said, I will go after my lovers, those who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. She will chase after her lovers. I'm skipping just one verse here. She will chase after her lovers, but she will not reach them. She will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. But she does not know that I myself have given her the ripe grain, the new wine, and the fresh oil. And I have increased silver for her, but they have made the gold into Baal. Therefore I shall take back my ripe grain at its time, and my new wine in its season. I shall snatch away my wool and my linen for covering her nakedness. Now I shall uncover her disgrace in view of her lovers, and no one shall deliver her from my hand. I shall bring an end to all her celebrating, her festival, her new moon, her Sabbath, and her every holiday. I shall ravage her vine and her fig tree, of which she has said, they are prostitutes' wages for me, which my lovers have given me. And I shall make them a forest, and the wild beasts shall eat them. A lot of metaphors at work here in these few verses, but there are two major symbols I want you to be aware of. The one is obviously that symbolism, that metaphor of adultery, fornication, prostitution, because Hosea married presumably already a prostitute who continues in that business even after marrying. And this is symbolic of what? You tell me.
People that reacted to it. They've gone after multiple false gods. Adultery.
That's
Period.
right. Yeah, so just as, in this case of Hosea's life, his wife had been unfaithful to him, so too, what this stands as a symbol for, in the relationship between Yahweh and his people Israel, that was supposed to be understood as an exclusive relationship, just like the modern covenant we have of marriage, right? Forsaking all others. Some versions of marriage vows put that in there. That means, nobody else is going to be a candidate for my husband or for my wife. It's going to be just the two of us now. And that's how Israel's relationship with Yahweh was supposed to be. In a context, socially speaking, where all of their neighbors were very accustomed to serving multiple gods. So Israel was a very strange nation amidst all these others because they chose to worship one God. And yet they broke that initial commitment. They broke that covenant by going after multiple gods. And so that's akin to committing adultery. They are bringing an infraction on the covenant promises they had made to their God Yahweh, that he would be their only God, forsaking all others. That's one of the major metaphors at work here. As well as, along with that, the fact that in that culture, I'm not condoning this practice, but in that patriarchal culture, in that time and place, if a woman was caught in adultery, especially in a lot of localities, her husband might bring her out into a public venue, public square or what have you, and strip her naked. Again, I do not condone this. For that matter, I don't think this text is even meant to condone that practice, but it's using it because it's understood in that cultural context. So let's make sure we understand that principle. Unfortunately, texts like these have been misused in the past to do harm to women, and we should not take that message away. Read chapter 4 on your own time, by the way, and you'll see that Hosea adds a little additional message saying, I'm not even all that angry at the women. It's you men who are just as guilty. You're the guilty parties. So even he wants to make it clear, I'm not trying to make this an issue of misogyny, of hate against women. But again, he's using a cultural norm at the time. So if you were a wronged husband, you could shame your wife publicly like that and take off the clothes as a way of saying, she has given her body to others, and now everyone is to know this. Now, that's one of the metaphors that's at work here. And in this sense, what is God stripping away from Israel? That's, part of that language, especially that language of hate. And what else? Covenant relationship? Say again? Certainly he's calling them to the floor. So you might say hypocrisy itself is stripped away. There's no hiding when it's put on the table like that. Jesus did the same thing, didn't he?
The land was given to them and all the things that goes with that.
Yes. Yes, so he's taking away eventually, as you see especially these last verses, eventually it's going to be even taking away from the land. Especially that last verse indicates the language of exile, that the land is going to be uninhabited and given back to the wilds. But even before that, God's also going to start taking away their grain, their oil, their wine, all these products of the land. And so that's the equivalent in that metaphor of stripping away the honorable clothing of the wife because she has broken that covenant. But there's another way that metaphor works in this passage. You see, the way that a lot of these local Canaanite cults worked, even before the Israelites settled into that region, is that there are many worship practices where if you worshiped Baal, a very common deity around that region, you worshiped him as a fertility god. as a God that you thought brought the rains and renewed the agricultural cycle year in, year out. And this was often symbolized as a sexual union between Baal and whoever his consort might be. It varied depending on location. And so, in the worship practices of peoples of this region, once again, even before the Israelites settled that land, in many cases you would go to a temple, a shrine, you would pay some kind of a temple fare, and you could sleep with a cultic prostitute, with a temple prostitute, thus symbolizing, from their standpoint, the union between Baal and his consort, who basically represents sort of the earth goddess type, and that symbolizes the agricultural cycle, how it's rejuvenated. From the standpoint of Canaanites, they thought that this was very religious and spiritual, but God told his people otherwise. He said, you are not to follow the customs either of Egypt, from where you came, you can read this in Leviticus 18, or the customs of the peoples in whose land you're going to be. Right? You are supposed to be a different people if you are God's people. And yet the Israelites had fallen in with the practices of the land around them and had engaged in some of this practice. And they thought of Baal accordingly, perhaps, as sort of a deity that they render these sexual favors to, so to speak, and then he rewards them with the bountiful harvest when the time comes. So the other way that this metaphor works here is God stripping away from Israel, as a husband from an unfaithful wife, these goods, but it's also God stripping away the goods that he supplies as the God of Israel, as the creator God for that matter, the goods that these people, these Israelites, thought that Baal was giving them. Right? They were relying upon Baal. Many of them probably still worshiping, at least rendering some kind of lip service to Yahweh, and thinking, you can be sure, that they were doing no wrong in the process. That's why they have to be woken up, and what they're doing has to be called out on the floor as adultery, as unfaithfulness to God, unfaithfulness to the covenant with God. Well, I'm afraid we don't have that much time left, but I want to end on at least this good note. And I want to encourage you, in this context of Hosea, we'll continue next week. Go ahead, read chapters 6 and 11, especially, if you want to get the gist of what we'll study next week. But be thinking of this. It's a very easy thing to stand back and cluck our tongues at these Israelites, right, and say, how foolish could they have been to worship those idols? Very easy to do that. The harder thing and the better thing to do is to ask of ourselves, okay, honestly, what are my own idols? We may not live in the same kind of cultural backdrop where idolatry is so prominent or so evident as they're at in terms of figures of wood, stone, and so forth. Maybe we are. But we all have our idols. We all have things we need to smash because they are getting in the way of our relationship with God. What are those in your life? What do you put your trust in, for that matter, for security, for goods? And if that were stripped away from you, it would leave you feeling vulnerable, even though you should be a person of God, trusting in falling back on his arms. But if you'll permit me, let me read these verses, because this is not the end of the story. Therefore, I am about to entice her. This is God speaking about Israel. I'm going to woo her. I shall cause her to walk in the wilderness. Sounds familiar, right? The wilderness time coming out of Egypt. And I shall speak to her heart. I shall give her vineyards from there, the valley of Achor as an opening of hope. She shall respond there as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up from the land of Egypt. It shall be in that day, declares Yahweh, that you will call me my husband. You will not call me my master, which in Hebrew is Baal, any longer. Both of these terms mean husband, by the way. But the idea here is that the idea of the concept of Baal had become conflated with Yahweh in the eyes of many of these Israelites. They merged Baal worship with Yahweh worship and thought they were doing no wrong. Again, do we do any of the same things today? Let me suggest one of the dangerous areas can be in our sense of nationalism and our sense of Christian identity. Our allegiance, first and foremost, should not be to the flag, nor to this country in any formulation of it. Our first allegiance should be to God and his kingdom. Amen? Amen, right? But I'm afraid many times a threat in our country, in our current situation, Our own version of Baalism, if I dare say, may sometimes be the joining of the flag with the cross. Be wary of that, brothers and sisters. Be very wary of that. It's very enticing. But God says, the story's not over. I will woo her. And it's that classic love story, right? Just like you hear on the radio, God is singing this song saying, I will win her back. Right? And his best friends say, go get her. Right? And so thankfully, we are that people as well. We are the new Israel. We enjoy the fruits of God's grace. So his grace be with you. Thank y'all.